La Dolce Vita is very much the film of that moment of transition in Italian society, the Italian economy, but in particular Rome, from being, if you like, a kind of heritage city living off tourism, a city with lots of areas of poverty, to one that's living through the boom. I mean, the film is about a new Rome, but it's also clearly about the old Rome. So it's a kind of montage of different Romes. So it starts with this famous opening shot of the helicopter flying over the Aqua Claudia, one of the old aqueducts in the Park of Aqueducts. So, you've got ancient Rome in the very first shot, juxtaposed with a helicopter and an image of Christ. So it's a wonderful kind of bringing together of modern technology in the oldest bits of Rome. And you also see that new Rome under construction in the opening sequence. As the helicopter flies over, you see these builders looking up at it, and they're working on construction sites. Because 1960, the year after the film is shot, you get the Olympics held in Rome. So Rome is being literally restructured. And in fact, there's a shot in the Dolce Vita where Marcello is at Steiner's apartment after he's killed his children and himself, and he's standing on the balcony, and there's a slide behind. It's not a real shot, but it's the new Olympic sports stadium designed by Piacentini with the engineered dome by Nervi, and the fungo, the water tower that you also see in Antonione's L'Eclisse behind. So, it's kind of capturing that new architecture of Rome. And then along the way you do get this sort of moving together of bits of the old Rome and the new Rome. So he goes with Maddalena. They drive the prostitute back to her home. She says it's in a row called Cessati Spiriti, but I think it's in one of the new districts. It's shot probably Prenestino, so these large 1940s or 1950s blocks where there's a lot of kind of unmade road. The roads haven't been finished. So that's very much the kind of Rome rising 50s, 60s Rome, the building boom. Then you get heritage Rome. So you get the Trevi Fountain in that key sequence in the film. And of course that had been iconic from Roman Holiday, 1953, Three Coins in the Fountain, is it 1955? So, all the kind of American tourist films in Rome showed those sites, and Fellini puts them in as a kind of, almost like a homage to that, but it's not central. And then of course there's Via Veneto, which had become, the street of conspicuous consumption, wealth, the movie stars. There was the old aristocracy, there was the new money of people who come through the movie industry, kind of mixing together in that area. And Fellini constructs a section of that in Cinecittà, and that becomes the sort of point where people keep going back in the film. And I think there's also the growth of media. There's this really interesting flow-through from the real world of the kind of mass-mediated Rome of 1958-59 and the fictionalized world in the film. I think the film is a kind of document in a way. I mean, it's clearly not a documentary, but a lot of what you see in the film is taken from events that really happened. For instance, Anita Ekberg, who had been living in Rome after the mid-50s, she was there to shoot War and Peace, the King Vidor production. And she stays on living in Rome with her husband, Anthony Steele, and they become these celebrity figures around the Via Veneto. She really does take a dip in the Trevi Fountain. It's photographed, a famous photograph is in the press. So Fellini is reconstructing a kind of media event that's already happened in reality. Or the whole sequence of the miracle, where they drive out and there are these two children who claim they've seen the Virgin Mary appear to them. And that had actually taken place as well. Tazio Secchiaroli, who's one of the models for Paparazzo in the film, who knew Fellini, went out to this village, did a photo story about it. Fellini read the story and said, OK, we're going to make that into a section of the film. So there's this constant sort of flow-through of real events, but always media events and the kind of mediated world of the film. But I think that in some ways that has dogged people's perception of the film, because it's made it difficult to see the film as a text, as a film. You can't really separate the film as a text from the film, the world around the film. And that's partly because when the film was being shot, Fellini deliberately wanted to draw attention to it. He invited journalists and TV crews to watch him filming. The shoot was very long. It lasted 5 months, I think, from March to August 1959, and it was constantly being reported on the press, because it was very expensive, it was very lavish, there was a lot of fashionable people in it. It became a media event itself. So it's very difficult to separate the media event that Fellini wanted to generate around the making of the film from the film itself. and even from the media hype that it created after it was released. I mean, Fellini once said that the Via Veneto was transformed by his film, that it's not what it used to be because people go there now trying to imitate the way people behave in the film. Actresses turn up in night dresses, people do scandalous things because that's how they think the Via Veneto should be. So, from the before the film to the film itself to the after, there's a kind of continuous flow, and it's very difficult to isolate the film from that flow and see it as a film. The fact that the film is a kind of game of mirrors makes it very modern or postmodern. I think Fellini was very aware he was doing something radical and different with structure. I mean, he refers to it already in interviews when he's making the film as, he calls it a Baroque fresco. And he also says it's quite Picasso-like. He's trying to sort of decompose an image and break it up into fragments. Or he says it's like smashing a sculpture and then putting the bits together. So, he's aware that he's making a fragmentary movie and he wants that. His earlier films really don't anticipate this break you get with La Dolce Vita. Perhaps to some extent I Vitelloni, which is the film that's closest in feel to it. This film he made in 1953 about a group of male friends in a provincial town. It is sort of episodic. There isn't really a kind of plot as such. But the La Dolce Vita is much more radically kind of decentered. There really isn't a plot or plot entanglements or a resolution. It's just a series of episodes which are held together by the presence of Marcello. Marcello is really as much an observer as he's a protagonist. He often listens to people talking to him. He listens to Steiner's monologues, or he observes what's going on in the miracle, or he takes all this angry stuff from Emma. And the only time he really reacts back is when he gets angry with Emma on the phone or in the row, or when he gets drunk at the end at the party, and then he starts making all these sexual remarks about people. But I think for most of the film, he's a kind of passive figure who in some ways is an extension of the audience. We observe through Marcello this world. He becomes the sort of figure with whom we move. And of course, he's the figure who links all the episodes together. So he's a kind of character and not a character at the same time. He's not really rounded out as a character because he's got to be, in some ways, an empty vehicle. I think the scene in the castle where Maddalena Anuka May seats Marcello down on a chair in the middle of a room, and then she disappears down some corridors and magically manages to convey her voice to him. She's sitting over a kind of ornamental basin, a lavabo, and she speaks into it, and somehow the whisper is conveyed to the room. And it's a very haunting sequence. And I think it shows a number of things. One is the emotional instability of Marcello. He wants to drift from woman to woman. He doesn't want to have a stable relationship. But at the same time, once he gets spoken to in that way, he reacts to it. So it's like he's able to fall in love, but not really sure if he wants to. I think it's very remarkable also because of the way the scene is composed and lit. It's one of a series of shots in the film which use this very wide rectangle, the scope frame, just about twice as wide as it's high, to put a figure with a lot of empty space around him. There's a shaft of light coming from the side and he's sitting there, and then the extraordinary acoustic effect of this whispering. It's very, very magical, and I think it's one of the things that Fellini creates on set rather than something you can write in the script. The point is, I think, that he's using what for him is a new or relatively new kind of wide compositional frame, and he does unusual things with it. One is, I think, he creates this sense of empty space repeatedly. Some examples of that: the hospital where Emma is taken to have her stomach punctured after the suicide attempt is actually not a hospital. It's a real building in Eor, in E42, what was the new district built for the 1942 Expo. It's the same building that Bertolucci uses in The Conformist, where he has the ministry, the fascist ministry. So that building was used to create a sort of sense of wide empty space in different ways. And, there's an extraordinary shot of, while Emma's in the room being treated, Marcello's walking up and down, and a nun nurse wearing this extraordinary headdress is walking up past him. So he uses that sense of a kind of alienated, almost like a science fiction set, but it's a real place. Then I think the other one that's very striking is the sequence with his father, when his father comes to visit. And that's another kind of very strange descent into melancholy, because the father comes sort of cheerful, happy to see him, telling him off for not writing home more. And then they go out to a club that the father remembers having gone to in the 1920s, and he gets drunk on champagne. and then he's flirtatious with this young dancer, Fanny Magali Noel, and she drives him home to cooking spaghetti, as she says. And then she comes out, a little bit later saying to Marcello, your father's been taken ill. And he goes upstairs and he sees the father, and we see him from behind sitting in a chair right in the middle of the frame, so empty space on both sides, looking out of an open door onto the balcony. It's a studio constructed shot, so it's beautifully lit from the other side. And Marcello goes up and he very gently lifts his father's jacket over his shoulders to keep him warm. It's a very, very beautiful sequence. The other thing he does is the opposite of emptying out the shot, is he populates it, he kind of overpopulates it. So in the two scenes in Steiner's apartment, the first where there's the party, you have something like 14 or 15 characters in frame, standing, seated, right, kind of Visconti sort of shot. And then, in a way, that's reproduced at the end. The second time that Marcello goes there, of course, he gets the phone call to come over there, and Steiner has killed his children, shot himself. And there's a point of view shot. The door opens, and Marcello goes in, and you see again about 15 characters in the shot. And Steiner's there, but you don't see at first that he's there and he's dead. He's slumped over in a chair. And then there's a cut to a medium shot, and you see that it's Steiner. So, this brilliant use of either emptying out the frame or filling it up with characters, both of which have very powerful effects. The emptying out gets that sense of sort of alienation and pain and melancholy, and the filling it up is a kind of false, in the case of the party, a sort of false filling of people's space and time because they've got nothing else to do. One of the things that some critics said about La Dolce Vita at the time was that it was excessively negative reading of what was going on in Italy, because after all this was also a time of rising living standards. An Italy of poverty was generally being replaced by many people by an Italy with high employment and rising standards of living, and people got TVs and cars. So all the kind of positive side of that for masses of Italians is not really there. It's just this kind of decline of a corrupt class or a corrupt set of people. And I think a lot of people, not just Fellini, were very engaged with what was happening, if you like, morally and spiritually to Italy in that time of modernization, the boom of the late 50s, early 60s. Italy had changed so fast and so dramatically in the space of 10 years. It goes from the Italy of poverty, of bicycle thieves in 1948, to this Italy of wealth. It becomes one of the, the richest industrial countries by the mid-60s. And I think the one with the fastest growing economy in the West. So, the transition is very shocking, and what happened is it shakes up all old values. The values of the Catholic Church and of the family, get shaken up. People change the nature of their relationships. They, live with their girlfriends. There's a kind of whole change to, if you like, kind of sexual and public mores. And I think Fellini, like a lot of people, read this as something that should produce anxiety. We should be concerned about this, what's happening to standards. Clearly he wasn't sort of sexually conservative, but he said, what's actually happening to us as a people collectively? What's happening to, standards? And in a way, there is a slightly conservative dimension to the film. Fellini was no Marxist, he was no radical, he wasn't a Pasolini, he wasn't going to make films about the Borgate. He was going to make films about this new Italy from the inside with a kind of critical edge. So it takes, one section of Italian society, you might say perhaps the most symptomatic one of the new change, and gives it a very kind of anxious reading. I don't personally go for the idea that films are timeless or they transcend their period. I mean, even the greatest films, make much more sense if you try and understand them in the context in which they were made. And I think La Dolce Vita is, a film that we can still see and enjoy today. It's very rich, but you get a lot more out of the film if you can try and locate it in that moment. It is a film about that Italy in transition, and you have to read it, I think, in that context. It makes a lot of sense as a kind of mirror of that world.